This lighthouse was called cursed, haunted, or downright worthless by many who inspected it. But you won't see it that way for long. While most people turned away, one unlikely clue changed everything. What did a cat sense here that people had missed for decades? That single detail pulled a grieving widow into a story she never expected. Stay with me to the end to hear exactly what the cat uncovered and how it all began with what looked like the most hopeless inheritance anyone could receive. Imagine losing your partner and being told the thing you inherit is essentially worthless. That's where this widow found herself. The papers came when she was still deep in grief, delivering not comfort or stability, but a heavy responsibility she hadn't asked for. On the page, it was just words. Yet, in reality, it was a lighthouse falling apart at the edge of the sea. Several agents assessed the property and warned her it would be nearly impossible to sell. They pointed out the most obvious problems: sagging floors, iron eaten away by years of salt air. Everything else, the broken glass, the leaking roof, the tilted staircases, could be summed up in one conclusion: the place was more burdened than blessing. One even suggested it might cost more to tear down than to keep it standing. Neighbors didn't make things any easier. Local stories suggested the former keeper had left suddenly, and rumors about strange lights and footsteps circulated for years. Some swore you could hear movement in the tower at night, even after it was decommissioned. Whether those tales had roots in fact or fear hardly mattered. They all carried the same warning. This was not a place you wanted to stay connected to. Those closest to her echoed the same advice. Friends urged her to walk away while she still could. Why chain herself to a neglected building, miles from anything familiar? Her own finances barely covered the basics of life, and grief itself is demanding. The thought of patching holes and paying taxes on a place she never asked for seemed impossible. Public listings over the years only confirmed that no one else wanted it either. Attempts to sell the lighthouse had started and stopped more than once, leaving notes in the records about failed interest and structural danger. It was as if the tower itself refused to pass hands. Yet, there was a pull she couldn't quite explain. Something about abandoning it without ever seeing it left her uneasy. She could let gossip and reports make the choice for her, or she could at least stand on the cliff herself, feel the space, and decide with her own eyes. Sometimes, grief plants a kind of stubborn resolve, the voice that says, "Don't look away just because it's hard." So she gathered what she needed for a brief trip, sliding her cat into the carrier and pointing the car toward the coast. The drive stretched on, each mile bringing her closer to a coastline she only knew through documents and other people's warnings. She wasn't going only to inspect an unwanted property. She was on her way to encounter a place where time seemed to have stopped, and where silence had been holding unanswered questions for decades. The road that led her to the lighthouse had nearly disappeared, swallowed by blackberry vines and tall grass. When the clearing opened, the tower rose ahead, its outline sharp against the gray sea. From a distance it looked stubborn, standing when it had every reason to collapse. Up close, time's damage was unmistakable. Rust streaks dripping down like old stains, railings broken into jagged gaps, and deep cracks splitting through the stone. A corroded padlock broke under the key, and the door swung with reluctant weight. Inside, the air was thick, a mix of damp wood and stone, with a faint sweetness, like flowers abandoned too long in a closed drawer. Dust softened every surface. A chair leaned against the wall mid-motion, as if someone had risen in a hurry and never returned. Faded curtains hung in tatters behind windows sealed with boards. On the table, a lone teacup waited, its contents evaporated into a dark ring, Think of it like a photograph left in a drawer, faded at the edges, but the picture still readable. Then came a sound, a single creak, slow and deliberate, traveling down from above. It carried the weight of footsteps on the stairs, though no one else was there. Paired with the wind pressing through unseen cracks, the building seemed to breathe in its own language. Stories of disappearances, once distant rumors, suddenly felt sharper in that silence. The storms of this coastline explained much of the damage. Years of waves striking the tower, sometimes high enough to lash the windows, could wear out any structure. Yet, none of that explained the stillness of the rooms themselves, as if life here had stopped all at once. The greater weight wasn't the structure. It was the isolation. No neighbors, no traffic, no light on the horizon. Only wind, gulls, and the endless pull of the tide. For someone carrying grief, such quiet pressed in on every side, filling what words and company once absorbed. You could almost feel swallowed by it. But then you noticed the smaller things. The way floorboards near the stairs seemed less worn, perhaps covered once by a rug. The faint pencil marks on a doorframe, recording small changes in height. A patch on the wall where a picture frame must have hung, its outline still visible against lighter paint. These were not marks of abandonment. They were signs of love and presence, of someone's rhythm of living here. And that awareness changed everything. This wasn't just a ruin standing on the cliff. It was layered with memory, some human story left behind in fragments. The widow could sense that now. This place mattered to someone once, and maybe still held more than it showed. She stood in the silence, aware that another presence had come with her into this forgotten space. Sometimes it's the quietest companions who notice what we fail to see. The moment she opened the carrier, the cat acted differently. Instead of hesitating or circling the room as it usually did, it stepped out with intent, tail upright, ears alert. It ignored the scattered furniture and peeling walls, moving instead toward one corner of the room, near where the kitchen joined the main space. She noticed it press its nose along the baseboards, then return again and again to that same section. Unlike most cats she'd known, this one showed an unusual, steady focus on one wall. Its movements weren't the nervous darts of fear or the casual passes of curiosity. The cat crouched low, listening, body taut as though registering something just beyond the plaster. At first, she explained it away. Maybe the strange echoes of the place played tricks on sound. Maybe there were faint drafts slipping through hidden cracks. In an old structure like this one, either was possible. But the behavior didn't end once the novelty of the space wore off. Even after several visits, the pattern held. The door would open, the cat would leap forward, and within moments it was back at that same section of wall, pawing, sniffing, even sitting for long minutes as if waiting. You can picture her watching, half distracted by leaks, costs, and crumbling staircases, while the cat ignored everything except that corner. What could draw a pet to one unremarkable wall over and over? The lighthouse offered no obvious reasons. Records showed nothing about pets being kept there before. No scratch marks, no hidden nests. The surface itself seemed no different than any other. The same fading paint, the same cracks where dampness had left its mark. Yet her companion would not leave it alone. She began to treat it less as a passing quirk and more as a message. The animal's persistence forced a shift in her attention. Normally, a cat's interest wanes after a few days. This stretched into weeks. Each time she unlocked the heavy door, it walked straight to that wall, as though nothing else in the tower mattered. The light outside could change from fog to sun. The wind could batter at the glass. But the cat responded only to that one place. It was easy to feel overwhelmed in a building full of problems. Yet the more she saw that unwavering interest, the harder it became to ignore. A single, ordinary surface had been made strange by the certainty of an animal's focus. If grief had left her blind to details, her companion seemed determined to point one out for her. And so she reached the point where dismissal gave way to curiosity. The time had come to kneel where the cat kept returning, and lay her own hand against the wall that seemed, at least to one set of senses, different from the rest. Up close, the wall looked ordinary. Same paint as the others. Same faint cracks and water stains creeping up from the floor. At a glance, nothing about it stood out, but when she ran her hand across the surface, it felt wrong. The plaster here was smoother, tighter, almost too neat. The trim at the bottom joined with cleaner seams, and the wood looked less weathered than everything else. It was subtle, but in a place where time had touched every surface, this section seemed to resist aging. According to the plans she'd checked, nothing unusual should have been in this spot. The drawings showed a solid wall as part of the original build, yet what her fingertips found didn't feel original. The materials were just slightly off: the plaster, the way the ceiling met the wall, even the way light caught at the edges. Then came the simplest test. She tapped once, listening. On either side, the walls gave a solid thud, the dense sound of masonry, but at this section, a hollow note. She tapped again, sliding sideways, and the tone shifted back to solid. 2 feet across, the difference was undeniable. Even the cat froze at the sound, ears twitching, head turning back toward that spot as if to confirm what she was hearing. She checked the weathering again. Other walls showed streaks from leaks, faint lines of salt crystals, discoloration from decades of storms. This patch showed almost none of that. No obvious stains, barely any cracking, as if it had been built at a different time, or with materials not exposed in the same way. When she looked into the property records, all she could find were notes about routine fixes, basic upkeep, small repairs. Nothing about sealing off a part of the inside. No mention of interior work that could explain a false wall. That left her with a clear but unsettling thought. Someone had added this later. The precision in the finish wasn't about repair. It felt more like disguise, an effort to cover something while making it look like it had always been there. Why would anyone spend the time to hide a pocket of empty space in a lighthouse no one lived in? If it was modification, what made secrecy worth the effort? You begin to see why her thinking shifted here. The mystery was no longer just her cat's odd behavior. The structure itself was speaking through seams, surfaces, and sound. Something about this wall didn't belong, and soon the quiet persistence of her companion would force the first real break in its surface. Sometimes the smallest gesture changes everything. The cat's clawing at the base of that wall wasn't messy or random. It was steady, focused, always in the same spot. Day after day, those front paws worked at a narrow strip of trim where wood met floor, as if it knew something waited there. On their 4th visit, that persistence finally paid off. A piece of the baseboard, no larger than a finger, shifted loose. It slid away cleanly, revealing more than scratched wood. Behind the gap was not a solid foundation, but an opening. The cat immediately pressed its whiskers in, nose twitching as if the darkness itself carried meaning. When she knelt beside it, she braced for packed earth or stone. Instead, her flashlight beam was swallowed by space. The light didn't bounce back. It just disappeared, as though shining into a throat with no end. There were no studs, no back wall, no supports, only blackness where there should have been structure. She reached closer. A faint draft slipped out, brushing her skin with air colder than the room around her. Along with it came a smell, dry, stale, untouched, like the inside of a sealed trunk kept closed for decades. In one moment, she understood. This was no simple crack. This was a hidden chamber, breathing out after years in silence. The weight of responsibility pressed down. Old buildings are fragile, and altering them always carries risk. She knew preservation experts often caution against disturbing original fabric. What if breaking into a hidden space weakened the walls further? What if prying revealed nothing but damage? The hesitancy was real, especially after weeks of staring at all the other repairs this place demanded. Still, everything pointed to a deliberate concealment. Someone, at some point, had taken real care to build a false wall. The surface had been smoothed, the finish matched, the seams disguised so perfectly it fooled anyone passing by. Except a cat who refused to be tricked. In that persistence, all her doubts began to shift. You can almost feel her weighing it out in silence. Fingertips on the edge of the loosened trim. Flashlight beams searching for answers. Cat waiting at her feet. She didn't need to tear the wall apart. Not yet. But she also couldn't leave this as just a mystery glimpsed through a hole in the wood. Here's what actually happened. She chose a middle path, enough to look further, but carefully. She decided to widen the gap only slightly, just enough to see what space lay behind without wrecking the wall outright. That deliberate choice marked the true beginning of what came next. Because once you recognize a hidden void exists, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Why was it sealed at all? And that question doesn't get answered by peering into darkness. It begins with seeking out the history that the silence tried to cover. What parts of a story get remembered? And what quietly disappears? That was the question in her mind when she turned to the local historical society and began digging through old files. Some folders hadn't been touched in decades, their contents yellowed and brittle. What she found wasn't clear information, so much as a pattern of blank spaces. Gaps, where you'd expect regular entries, details that seemed to vanish just when they should have mattered most. The official Lighthouse logs, usually steady with notes about weather and repairs, had missing stretches. Entire periods left unrecorded. Silence where routines should have been. Village meeting minutes hinted at keepers who were more private than welcoming. Eccentric was the word that surfaced, often tied to small disputes about their refusal to open the tower for inspection. One report even noted how a keeper altered the building by boarding up certain windows, leaving only the seaward view open. These fragments suggested that during some stretches, the lighthouse was more than just a navigation aid. Outside the town records, she found thin mentions in materials tied to wartime defense. None spoke directly about the lighthouse, but several referred to this stretch of coast holding monitoring value, without spelling out why. The phrasing repeated often enough to suggest strategic interest, though details were obscured. Some notes looked pared down, as if entire lines had been kept back. It left her with the impression that more existed somewhere else, just beyond reach. Turning to newspapers, she spotted only the faintest trails. Old bulletins noted unexplained light patterns seen offshore, and one short piece about a coastal road closed for maintenance, with no further explanation. These were not proofs, but they stood out, especially when placed beside the silences in official logs. They read less like everyday chronicles and more like placeholders for something unspoken. And then came memory, the kind passed by word of mouth, softened over time. Several elderly residents recalled being told not to go near the lighthouse when they were children. One remembered her father casually calling it the listening post, though she never knew what he meant. Another spoke of blackout drills during the war when the lighthouse stayed dark, even while other beacons kept faint signal lights burning. Unlike official records, these recollections carried the texture of lived experience, even if the details blurred. Piecing these scraps together, the widow began to see the lighthouse differently. The missing entries, the vague defense language, the stories told to children, all suggested something deliberate, something layered into the history without being written into it. If that was true, the sealed space in the wall might not have been a simple hiding place. It could be part of whatever work had drawn attention to this lonely tower during those years of silence. That thought deepened her unease, but also sharpened her determination. This was no longer just about structural oddities. It was about uncovering a truth the official record chose not to preserve. And if the sealed room was more than a personal hideaway, what else might it contain? The only way forward was to open it further, to let light reach what the darkness had kept hidden. She braced herself and widened the opening just enough to peer inside. Dust lifted into the beam of her flashlight, and with it came the first thing she noticed: the smell. It wasn't the damp, rotting air of the outer rooms. This air was dry, still, and layered with scents of old paper, wool, and a faint metallic tang, like coins left in a drawer too long. Her light cut through silence that felt heavier than the walls around her. At first it illuminated nothing but drifting particles. Then she adjusted and saw the beam stretching farther than expected. By the outside layout, there shouldn't have been room here, yet her light slipped into a space large enough to absorb it, fading into darkness instead of striking stone. Shadows began to gather shape. A desk against one wall, shelving built into another, a larger rectangle that resembled a cot or bed frame. Every surface shared the same blurred outline from a thick coating of dust. But there were no cobwebs clinging in corners, no insect tracks across the shelves. It looked as though air had not moved in there for years, keeping everything frozen mid-life. For a moment, her instinct was to stop. A wall like this could matter structurally, and forcing more access could risk the stability of an already fragile building. She also worried about hazards hidden inside old materials, so she kept her efforts careful and deliberate. Even so, the cat urged her on with intent focus. It sat close by, letting out small bursts of sound, as though restless for her to continue. Its calm persistence suggested this opening wasn't dangerous. It was significant. She cut a clean opening, just wide enough to truly see. The difference was immediate. This was no crawl space or crude storage void. It was a fully realized room, complete with finished walls and proper proportions. Her beam picked out an orderly arrangement. Furniture meant for use rather than storage, corners too neat to be accidental. The construction stood apart from the weather-beaten rest of the lighthouse. The plaster of the hidden room was smoother, more even, as if crafted with patience and precision. The trim joined seamlessly, with edges as straight as work newly polished. Most striking, the walls bore no streaks of damp, no warping from salt, no hint of the wear that storms had carved elsewhere. Everything had been protected, as though the space had been sealed with intent to last. That realization carried weight. This wasn't just a quirk of architecture or a corner adapted as storage. What she was looking at had been purpose-built, carefully concealed, and astonishingly preserved. Whoever made it wanted it strong, unseen, and enduring, even while the lighthouse around it crumbled. And now, with the first glimpse through the wall, she faced a greater mystery, not about the outside of the building, but the private world hidden within. How can a room look like it simply paused while the entire world kept moving? That was the feeling when she finally stepped through the narrow opening into the hidden space. The air was different here, dry and still, carrying the faint scent of old paper, wool, and metal. It felt like opening a box that had been closed for half a century. Right away, she saw evidence of another time. A calendar and a stack of newspapers pointed clearly to the mid-20th century. On the desk, a journal remained open, the inked handwriting stopping mid-sentence as though the writer had been interrupted and never came back. At the foot of a small cot lay a wool blanket, corners perfectly folded, as if waiting to be smoothed one last time before use. The dust settled evenly across every surface, undisturbed, as if no one had entered for decades. It wasn't only the artifacts that caught her eye, but their order. Books stood neatly on a shelf, their spines aligned. A few clothes, practical work shirts, trousers, and one formal jacket, hung in a wardrobe built to last. Even a small washstand, set with simple toiletries, remained carefully arranged. Nothing suggested chaos or emergency abandonment. Instead, everything looked prepared, almost like the occupant had stepped out intending to return. Details of the construction deepened the mystery. The single door had been fitted with an interior bolt, its seal reinforced against drafts or leaks. Slim ventilation pipes led upward through the ceiling, proof that the space was meant for more than storage. The false wall was not patchwork improvisation, it was precision work, built to hide the room completely while keeping it livable inside. Whoever made this room, they designed it to remain unseen yet secure. She found no indications of distress. The bed carried the normal wear of long use. Food tins lined a pantry shelf, sealed and still identifiable. Nothing suggested danger or forced confinement. The presence of a working radio, though it had long since fallen silent, hinted at connection beyond isolation. But without the means to transmit, it was a tool for listening, not for calling out. More subtle than any single object was the blending of daily life with professional work. Alongside photographs of smiling families lay official-looking documents. Beside the personal journal rested logbooks filled with neat, detailed observations. On one shelf, technical manuals stood next to well-thumbed novels. This wasn't a hiding place of desperation. It was both home and workspace, balanced carefully between private comfort and duty. As she stood there, piecing together the meaning, she began to suspect it was a sanctuary, not a prison. The care evident in the furnishings, the even rhythm of life it reflected, it felt less like confinement than like someone carving out safety in uncertain times. You can imagine her pausing in that dim light, surrounded by dust and silence, realizing that someone had lived quietly and deliberately behind that wall. And with that realization came a deeper question. If this was made as a sanctuary, what purpose had driven its secrecy? The answer, she knew, would lie inside the documents and records carefully preserved on the desk. What kind of purpose could drive someone to hide a fully equipped room behind a false wall? As the widow sorted through the papers and items she found, a new picture came into focus. On the surface, the official logbooks looked like any other lighthouse records, routine notes about weather, upkeep, and supplies. But the private journals told a different story. They carried details about ship patterns, references to strange signals, and notes of lights seen offshore that went far beyond everyday lighthouse work. Many of the writings weren't straightforward entries. Some used repeated phrases that seemed too structured to be casual notes. Others contained long columns of numbers or coded remarks that hinted at intentional communication. While the exact systems were unclear, the journals looked far more like organized reporting than personal musings. The objects in the room supported that impression. Alongside normal supplies were items clearly chosen for close observation. Powerful lenses, listening devices, and equipment that could monitor or signal beyond simple maritime duties. Technical manuals described navigation methods, recognition markings, and radio usage. Put together, these tools suggested the keeper was engaged in far more than just tending a light for passing ships. The journals also revealed inner conflict. The keeper wrote about strain and fatigue, about keeping two faces, one for the community and one for the hidden responsibility. Notes described the pressure of watching for signs others might miss and the fear of failing to observe something important offshore. Private reflections suggested the work weighed heavily, even as it was carried out with steady discipline. The choice to block off part of the lighthouse began to make sense. Sealing the room was practical. It protected the instruments, reduced the risk of discovery, and limited questions from visitors. What locals saw as odd solitude, the keeper avoiding contact or guarding the building too closely, was recast in a different light. In the widow's eyes, this was less eccentric reclusiveness than quiet operational security. Official paperwork seemed to back up that impression through omission. Property records listed the lighthouse only as a navigational aid. Maintenance logs read like routine inspections. Nothing in government files hinted at extra duties. To her, the silence looked deliberate, a way of shielding the truth while preserving the outward appearance of normal service. Understanding this shifted everything. The hidden room was not evidence of paranoia or neglect. It represented a personal commitment to a larger mission carried out in silence. The keeper had chosen vigilance and secrecy over recognition, balancing community mistrust against duties that couldn't be explained. At that moment, the widow paused to take in what it meant. The same building, written off as haunted or useless, had, in fact, sheltered years of quiet service. The story of the lighthouse had been inverted. What outsiders dismissed as abandonment looked instead like sacrifice. That realization marked a turning point, because if one person's work could be hidden so thoroughly, the question remained, how does a community come to forget a figure who served them in silence? The widow knew this discovery wasn't something she could carry alone. She turned to the local historical society, bringing photographs and carefully preserved documents from the hidden room. At first, the archivist raised an eyebrow, but interest quickly deepened as the materials were examined. Soon, the discussion shifted from doubt to recognition that this was a story their records had never captured. As word spread, older residents began sharing fragments they had carried quietly for years. One man remembered his father talking about the keeper's long absences during storms, how he sometimes stayed in the tower for days without rest. A woman recalled her grandmother pointing out strange flashes from the lighthouse windows, patterns unlike the steady navigation beams. Others spoke about warnings passed down in childhood to steer clear of the building because serious work was being done there. though no one explained it at the time. These weren't neat records, but scattered memories. A fishing family recalled being told on moonless nights to avoid certain waters without knowing why. Another household had saved receipts from the keeper's regular purchases, fresh food delivered promptly paid for, yet never shared with anyone inside the home. Each piece on its own was incomplete. Together, they formed a picture that matched what the widow found sealed away in the lighthouse. Archival material, too, held suggestive echoes. Wartime documents, when later consulted, hinted at coastal observation posts that operated undercover. They didn't name names, but their phrasing about watch points along this coast seemed to align with the evidence uncovered in the hidden room. In other words, once fragmentary memories were set beside preserved artifacts, patterns emerged where before there had only been rumor. Secrecy around wartime activities explained why recognition never followed. Those who carried such responsibilities had been barred from sharing details, even with family. Official paperwork had kept their role invisible. That silence lasted into the present, leaving ordinary community memory to frame the keeper as a reclusive oddity instead of a quiet participant in coastal defense. In the years afterward, the lighthouse passed from one keeper to another. Records show frequent changes, with people staying briefly before moving to other stations. None left notes suggesting they discovered the hidden chamber, and nothing in local files suggested an understanding of the building's deeper role. What endured were the sounds and sights that residents didn't understand. The extra lights, the static hum of radio work, the solitude. Over time, these ordinary traces of hidden duties grew into reputation: haunted, strange, cursed. But as the truth began to surface, that reputation started to change. For the first time, people saw that what they once mocked or feared might actually have been careful service carried out in silence. Historical society meetings gave space for these stories to be told aloud. School groups asked to learn, hearing it as an example of overlooked sacrifice at home. What once felt like a derelict nuisance on the coastline slowly turned into a symbol of resilience and duty. Suddenly, the lighthouse wasn't scandalous or cursed anymore. It looked like a place of quiet service. And once that shift in understanding took hold, people began asking the next question. If its story held such weight, how should its value be measured now? From the moment the hidden room came to light, the lighthouse was no longer viewed as a liability. Historical preservation groups responded with interest, noting that its discovery could represent a rare example of life preserved mid-century. The sealed air had protected even fragile items, leaving artifacts that looked as though they had been set down only yesterday. That kind of preservation, especially in a structure battered for decades by salt and storms, was enough to draw serious attention. Museum specialists suggested that the combination of personal belongings and professional tools had the potential to offer insight into homefront contributions during wartime. They saw value in the journals not only as historical notes, but as human records, voices that revealed how private lives intersected with greater events. It was the mix of everyday details and careful observation that gave the find its power. Public interest followed quickly. Instead of a forgotten building written off as unsafe, the lighthouse began to be seen as a cultural site. Residents who once warned others away now pictured school visits or guided tours. Archivists spoke about the potential for exhibits, and curators saw stories worth telling. What had been mocked as haunted was reinterpreted as purposeful. The financial shift felt just as dramatic. Before, property records valued the lighthouse only as land balancing against demolition costs. Now, discussion turned toward how designation and grants could offset restoration work. Preservation societies encouraged applications for funding, and some spoke about helping maintain the structure. On a practical level, this meant the widow suddenly faced options instead of obstacles. She found relief as support replaced the isolation of carrying expenses alone. Two outcomes mattered most. First, the possibility of grants gave her a way forward without needing to sell or abandon the place. Second, renewed respect from her community changed the way she stood in relation to the property. Her inheritance was no longer dismissed, it was recognized. Each of these gave her both financial stability and a sense that the effort to keep going had been worthwhile. The transformation wasn't in the walls themselves. The cracks and rust remained. Repairs were still urgent. Yet value had shifted completely. What once represented loss now carried meaning others wanted to preserve. In a way, the building itself had not changed, only the knowledge surrounding it had. And knowing the story changed everything. This insight tied back to the chain of discovery itself. It had taken persistence, attention, and a willingness to look again where others ignored. And in that process, one presence kept leading her forward, the quiet companion who first noticed what she had overlooked. What can animals notice that we so easily overlook? Sitting months later in the restored kitchen, the widow often watched her cat stretch into a patch of sunlight and thought back to the beginning. People saw burden. Repairs, costs, crumbling walls. Their vision stopped at what they could measure. Yet the animal responded to what lay beneath those surfaces, cues too subtle for human eyes alone. It wasn't mystery so much as different perception. The cat noticed drafts slipping through seams, faint echoes that didn't match the room's shape, and tiny vibrations that hinted at hidden space. Like reading a paragraph with a missing line, it filled in what she couldn't see. Where people wrote off the lighthouse as useless, the animal's focus on one wall revealed that something had been missed. At first, her pet's persistence looked like stubbornness. Why scratch at one plain wall when everything else around them sagged or leaked? But you begin to notice your pet's odd habits as data, not just charm. When behavior repeats with such focus, it may not be meaningless at all. If your pet ever behaved oddly in a house, tell us in the comments. I'd love to hear how their instincts shaped what you noticed. The widow's relationship with her cat changed through this discovery. Comfort gave way to collaboration. Each visit, the silence felt less empty because she no longer saw her companion as background support. The animal had taken on an active role in finding truth, and in her mind, that made them partners, not simply owner and pet. She also realized how the room could have remained hidden for decades had it not been for those extra senses. Previous keepers may have passed by the same wall countless times, but lacked a companion insistent enough to force attention. Practical eyes saw only maintenance tasks. Animal perception saw contradiction. Sometimes, it truly does take more than human capabilities to read the environment fully. From then on, she treated the cat's reactions differently. A sudden pause at an empty corner or an unusual stare at a window wasn't brushed aside. It was observed, noted, considered. Where we see stillness, an animal may hear or smell a signal tied to something larger. This shift of perspective made the world feel layered. her own senses only one version of reality. The lesson was not mystical, but practical. Truth arrived when both sets of observation, human and animal, came together. People calculate, compare, record. Animals sense air, sound, movement. Combining those streams built a fuller picture. The cat's persistence was not random. It was consistent response to real signals, ones our species is not built to notice. You understand, then? We underestimate the ways other creatures can extend our perception. What seemed like odd behavior turned out to be targeted, repeatable, and revealing. It wasn't the cat reading secrets from ghosts, but registering evidence in forms we miss. In hindsight, this recognition reshaped how she regarded her companion. It was not only affection or comfort. It was a reminder that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. And that understanding prepared her for the next step, where confronting hidden truths in the lighthouse would begin to reshape her own hidden grief. How can uncovering the past create space for healing in the present? For the widow, exploring the sealed room became more than a search for answers. It grew into a personal process of recovery. Sorting through the keeper's belongings felt like brushing against another life, shaped by loss and solitude. Both stories held grief, hers through sudden absence, the keeper's through years of isolation and unrecognized service. In those journals and artifacts, she recognized emotions that felt familiar, the weight of responsibility, the silence of carrying pain alone, and the strength to keep moving forward despite what was missing. The parallel gave her perspective. Reading the private entries showed how the keeper transformed loneliness into purpose, using duty to anchor herself when connection was lost. The widow began to see her own sorrow differently. Her grief was still real, but it no longer stood as the only story she could tell. You can see how sorting artifacts becomes a way to sort grief. Each item placed back in order, each note cataloged, offering moments of clarity in place of chaos. For her, the careful work of preservation helped in concrete ways. Cleaning fragile pages, labeling objects, and recording their history gave her small tasks where she could see immediate results. These steady routines lightened feelings that had once seemed immovable. The lighthouse also drew others back into her life. Historians, preservationists, and curious locals came with questions, stories, and offers of help. Conversations by the lantern stair or the kitchen table no longer felt forced. They grew naturally from shared interest in what the building revealed. These visitors constructed bridges she hadn't known she needed, connections that eased the loneliness she had accepted as permanent. In helping preserve one person's hidden story, she found her own way back to community. Practical change played a role too. Before, property taxes and looming repairs had consumed her thoughts, leaving little room to breathe. With recognition from preservation groups came resources and guidance, and with that came relief. The day-to-day pressure eased, and she finally had mental space to focus on herself. That combination, support from beyond the walls and purpose within them, made life feel possible again. Healing came not as a sudden shift, but as quiet momentum, built piece by piece. Her cat remained part of it all, first as comfort, then as partner, and finally as a constant reminder of what began the journey. Where once it simply kept her company, now it symbolized the bridge between hidden signals and discovered truth. The animal which comforted her became part of her purpose, and as she reflected, the question became clear. If one person and one companion could uncover so much inside a single building, What might happen if the entire lighthouse itself were given the chance to step out of shadow and show its true story? The change began when she shifted from inheriting a burden to claiming a legacy. Restoration became her choice, not simply her duty. She decided to bring the lighthouse back to life now that she understood what it had been hiding all those years. This time, repairs weren't just about patching damage. They were about preserving meaning. She worked with preservation groups to make a plan that balanced keeping the structure authentic with making it livable. Experts advised using traditional materials and techniques to avoid long-term damage, reminding her that newer fixes often create more problems over time. Everything from the way stones were set to how wood was joined had to respect the history of the place while allowing for safe daily use. Even the sealed room was left carefully intact, adapted into a small exhibit that allowed others to see what she had found without disturbing it. The hidden room became a centerpiece. She installed lighting gentle enough to protect fragile papers, but strong enough to let visitors glimpse the space as it had been left. A clear barrier showed the exact arrangement of objects without risk of tampering. Simple labels explained the keeper's dual existence, both practical caretaker and silent observer. The design aimed not to recreate, but to reveal what was already there. Community response changed quickly once they saw the care being taken. Where people once dismissed the property as an eyesore, they now offered assistance. Local workers offered services at reduced rates. Volunteers organized days to help with cleanup. Neighbors who had once told ghost stories now took pride in sharing the lighthouse's real role in history. Support didn't just arrive. It reshaped how people spoke of the building and its past. The shift in attitude spread beyond the town itself. Articles appeared in local media, drawing visitors interested in seeing the unusual discovery. Instead of being written off as worthless, the property was now described as a rare piece of preserved history. Historical designation offered some protection, and with it came new conversations about funding and long-term care. The widow, who once faced the prospect of selling or abandoning, suddenly had the means and motivation to remain. Through it all, she took on a new role. She wasn't only living in the shadow of someone else's history. She became the steward of it. She chose to live there and to open the site on limited visits, balancing her private home with the responsibility of caretaking. That dual purpose kept the building alive, both for her daily life and for the stories it now carried outward. She restored the light as a symbolic beacon, not to guide ships, but to remind people of the hidden work once done in secrecy. Its glow stood for memory and resilience more than navigation. With that choice, the lighthouse became both shelter and signal, grounded in the present while honoring the past. The lighthouse now stands as a living memorial, both a home and a public reminder of hidden service. And in the rhythms of this new life, one constant companion remained at the heart of it all. How does shared experience change the way two lives connect? For the widow and her cat, the bond that guided the discovery of the hidden room remained strong as they settled into life in the lighthouse. Their daily routine unfolded alongside the preserved history, each action shaped by a shared past that neither could ever forget. Some visitors did raise questions. Was it wise to keep an animal in a place now considered historically important? Preservation standards usually discourage it, especially where delicate surfaces or artifacts could be at risk. But she worked with experts to create a compromise. Safe boundaries and protective barriers ensured fragile areas remained untouched, while the cat kept its freedom within the parts of the home they used day to day. For her, keeping the animal was not just a preference, but an essential part of the story. This arrangement made life both ordinary and unusual. Mornings might start with feeding the cat and then checking humidity levels inside the sealed room. Visitors were welcomed in with care, while the animal often lingered by the entrance, as if drawn to the discovery point. These were only small details, but together they blended routine with remembrance. Other tasks, meals, household chores, cataloging artifacts, simply folded into that rhythm. Over time, she noticed how the cat moved through the place. Without training, it naturally kept its distance from fragile areas, drifting instead through living spaces where nothing important could be harmed. That simple habit eased her anxieties, making the balance of preservation and companionship smoother than she had expected. Their relationship had shifted. What began as a source of comfort during grief became a form of caretaking collaboration. She had learned to watch for small cues, how the animal might pause at a draft or show interest where changes in the environment had gone unnoticed. These behaviors became quiet signals, giving her early warnings of what to check or adjust. In return, she structured her work around their shared rhythm, treating the animal not as background company, but as a silent partner. Visitors often asked to hear the story. She told them how the cat would return endlessly to the same wall, how persistence and scratching exposed what her own eyes had overlooked. Retelling it never grew old. Each time, she found herself reminded that the discovery was not hers alone. Without that bond, the hidden space might have stayed sealed forever. She came to accept that their journey was woven together. The cat had moved in her life from comfort to collaborator, from presence to participant. And she herself had changed, from an uncertain inheritor to the steward of a history entrusted to her care. Together, they embodied two different kinds of awareness, and only when joined did the truth emerge. Their shared life became part of the site's ongoing story. And in quiet moments, she began to wonder what wisdom this unusual journey might hold, not just for her, but for anyone who chooses to look more closely at what the world leaves hidden. Every hidden room holds more than artifacts. It holds lessons. For the widow, those lessons went far beyond the walls of her lighthouse, and they're just as useful for you. The story reminds us that some of the most important insights come when you step past first impressions and keep paying attention, even when something seems empty or worthless. The first lesson is simple. Don't dismiss something too quickly. You've probably walked away from places, objects, or even opportunities because they looked broken, outdated, or inconvenient. But the lighthouse showed that an ordinary wall, cracked, faded, and overlooked, was actually keeping the most valuable secret in the entire building. Value isn't always obvious. If you judge only by the surface, you risk missing what lies beneath. The second lesson asks you to widen your perspective. Animals notice cues we often miss, and their behavior can point us toward truths hiding in plain sight. The cat wasn't mystically sensing ghosts or secrets. It was paying attention to drafts, faint echoes, and subtle shifts a person ignored. For her, listening to that consistent repetition turned an odd quirk into a discovery. For you, the takeaway is clear. Sometimes wisdom comes from other perspectives, even non-human ones, if you're willing to take them seriously. The third lesson is about curiosity itself. Conventional advice told the widow to sell, walk away, or cut her losses. But by following what sparked her interest instead, she uncovered value no one expected. Curiosity can create new worth where none seemed possible. You've likely faced times when the practical choice was to move on. But sometimes, the deeper value only shows up when you stay and look longer than others think reasonable. Her grief shaped all of this, too. At first, loss weighed down every part of her life. Yet by stepping into the mystery of the sealed room, she found a path that connected her pain to purpose. Put simply, her grief had unintentionally opened a path to a new purpose, reminding her that quiet exploration can transform even the heaviest seasons of life. Now here's something for you to try. The next time you inherit something odd, stumble into an abandoned space, or are urged to walk away from what looks useless, spend one deeper visit with an open mind. Stay a little longer than feels necessary. Look a little harder where you expect nothing. Curiosity may not always reveal history-changing discoveries, but it will always expand what you understand. Think of it like brushing dust from a faded photograph. You may not restore every detail, but even small shapes of the past come into focus once you bother to look. And sometimes, those faint shapes hold the greatest meaning, waiting for the right companion and the right moment to be seen again. Sometimes what looks worthless to others becomes priceless to you, especially when the right companion leads you there. This story shows that value doesn't always reveal itself at first glance. It reminds you to stay curious, to listen more closely, and to notice the signals that aren't obvious. Share your stories of surprising discoveries in the comments below, and subscribe for more hidden histories and strange, uncanny journeys. In the end, the lighthouse proved one lasting truth. Sometimes healing and history find each other in the most unlikely places.